The weight of desperation rested on Lillian Valmont's shoulders like a physical burden as she stood at the window of her small homestead, watching the setting sun paint the Colorado sky in hues of orange and crimson. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new life in Montrose had withered like crops in a drought, leaving her alone with 3-month-old Emma and a hopelessness that grew with each passing day. The baby's cry from the wooden cradle pulled Lillian from her thoughts. She crossed the rough-hewn floor of the one-room cabin, her steps heavy with exhaustion. Her fingers instinctively reached to tuck a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear hair that fell in thick waves to her waist, the one beauty she'd managed to preserve through the hardships that had claimed everything else. "SHH, my sweet girl," she whispered, lifting Emma to her chest. The infant's cries intensified, her tiny face reddening with hunger. Lillian's stomach twisted with the knowledge that her own body was failing them both. Her milk had been dwindling for days, her own hunger making it impossible to nourish her child properly. She glanced at the empty cupboard, its barren shelves a stark reminder of their situation. Thomas had been gone 6 months now, taken by the same fever that had swept through Montrose last winter, leaving behind nothing but debts and broken promises. The small pouch of coins he'd saved had lasted barely 2 months, and the vegetable garden she'd planted had yielded little in the unforgiving soil. "We'll find a way," she promised Emma, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. Tomorrow she would have to venture into town again to see if Mrs. Hannigan at the general store would extend her credit one more time, though she knew the answer would likely be the same as it had been 3 days ago. The night passed in fitful bouts of sleep, interrupted by Emma's hungry cries. By dawn, Lillian had made her decision. She'd overheard 2 women talking outside the mercantile last week about a traveling hair buyer who paid good money for long, undamaged hair to make wigs for wealthy women back east. He was due to pass through Montrose again today. Her hands shook as she brushed her hair, her one vanity, her mother's legacy. "Your hair is your crown," her mother had always told her, but crowns couldn't feed a starving child. With Emma wrapped securely against her chest in a worn shawl, Lillian walked the 3 miles into Montrose, rehearsing what she would say to the hair buyer, calculating how much food each inch might buy. The main street was already bustling with morning activity when she arrived, horses tied to hitching posts, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out a steady rhythm. She spotted the hair buyer's wagon near the hotel, a painted sign advertising fine human hair purchased, highest prices paid. Her steps faltered as she approached, but Emma's whimper against her chest steeled her resolve. The hair buyer, a portly man with small spectacles and nimble fingers, assessed her hair with the clinical eye of a cattle buyer at auction. "Excellent quality, madam. Chestnut with auburn highlights, quite desirable. 26 inches, I'd estimate. How much?" Lillian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. $8, he offered, watching her carefully. It was less than she'd hoped, but more than she had. $8 would buy flour, beans, salt pork, maybe even a small tin of condensed milk for Emma. It would keep them alive. 10, she countered weakly, knowing she had no leverage but desperate for every cent. The man pursed his lips. 9, and that's more than fair. There's been a decline in demand this season. Lillian nodded, unable to trust her voice. He gestured to a chair set up behind his wagon, partially shielded from the street by a canvas screen. "It won't take but a few minutes, madam." She sat rigidly, clutching Emma to her chest as the man sectioned her hair, binding it with cord before making the first cut. Each snip of his scissors felt like a piece of her dignity falling away. She closed her eyes, unable to watch as 26 inches of hair that Thomas had loved to run his fingers through, hair that her mother had braided every night until she died, dropped to the ground around her. "All finished," the hair buyer announced after what seemed like hours. "A fine contribution. The ladies back east will be most pleased." When he handed her the 9 silver dollars, Lillian couldn't bring herself to look at her reflection in the small mirror he offered. She tucked the money securely into her pocket, adjusted her shawl to cover her now exposed neck, and turned toward the general store, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by who noted her dramatically altered appearance. Mrs. Hannigan's eyes widened when Lillian entered the store, but to her credit, she made no comment about the choppy remains of hair that now barely reached Lillian's ears. "What can I get for you today, Mrs. Valmont?" For the first time in weeks, Lillian was able to place coins on the counter rather than plead for credit. 5 pounds of flour, 3 pounds of beans, salt pork, sugar, and do you have any condensed milk, as Mrs. Hannigan gathered the items. The bell above the door jingled, announcing another customer. Lillian kept her eyes downcast, one hand protectively cradling Emma's head against her shoulder, the other pulling her shawl higher to conceal her shorn hair. "Morning, Mrs. Hannigan," a deep voice greeted. "Got that order ready for the double circle? Just finishing up with Mrs. Valmont here, Mr. Quinn, then I'll fetch your supplies from the back," the shopkeeper replied. Lillian felt the newcomer's presence behind her, too close in the narrow space between counter and shelves, and she shifted uncomfortably, keeping her face averted. "No rush," he replied easily. Then, after a moment's pause, "Madam, your little one's blanket is slipping." Lillian turned slightly to adjust Emma's covering, and found herself looking up quite a ways up into the face of a man she recognized only vaguely as one of the hands from the Double Circle Ranch that lay 10 miles north of town. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a dust-covered hat he'd respectfully removed upon entering the store. His eyes, a clear blue that reminded her of summer skies, widened slightly as he took in her appearance, his gaze lingering for just a moment on her cropped hair before returning to her face. There was no judgment in his expression, only a flicker of something that might have been understanding. "Thank you," she murmured, turning away quickly. Mrs. Hannigan returned with a small tin of condensed milk. "Last one in stock until the next supply wagon," she said, placing it on the counter. "That'll be $7.40 total." Lillian counted out the coins carefully, painfully aware of the cowboy still standing nearby. The remaining $1.60 would need to last until she could find some kind of work. As Mrs. Hannigan wrapped her purchases in brown paper, Emma began to fuss again. "Poor little mite sounds hungry," Mrs. Hannigan observed, her tone sympathetic but her eyes curious, no doubt wondering about Lillian's circumstances. "Yes, I should get her home," Lillian replied, gathering her parcels awkwardly while trying to soothe the increasingly agitated infant. "Allow me," the cowboy said suddenly, stepping forward to take the packages. "These look heavy for someone carrying a baby." Lillian hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "I couldn't impose no imposition, madam. I'm headed back that way anyhow." "Jacob Quinn," he added with a slight nod of his head. "Foreman at the Double Circle." Before she could formulate a polite refusal, Mrs. Hannigan chimed in. "Oh, do let him help you, Mrs. Valmont. Mr. Quinn is as reliable as they come." Trapped by courtesy and the genuine difficulty of managing both baby and bundles for the long walk home, Lillian relented. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn. I live in the small homestead just past Willow Creek." "I know it," he replied simply, gathering her packages with ease. They stepped out into the bright morning sunshine, Emma's cries now escalating to full-throated wails. Lillian felt the stares of townsfolk, knowing they were taking in both her drastically shortened hair and the unexpected companionship of the ranch foreman. "My wagon's just down at the livery," Jacob Quinn said, nodding toward the end of the street. "Be easier on the little one than walking." The livery stable was only a short distance away, but by the time they reached the simple buckboard hitched to 2 sturdy bay horses, Emma's face was scarlet with distress, her tiny fists waving in helpless hunger. "She needs feeding," Lillian explained unnecessarily as Jacob helped her climb onto the wagon seat. "I bought condensed milk, but we'll get you home quick," he promised, placing her packages in the back before climbing up beside her. With a gentle click of his tongue, he set the horses in motion, handling the reins with the confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. As they left the town behind, Lillian tried to focus on calming Emma rather than the mortifying awareness of her appearance or the silent presence of the man beside her. He kept his eyes on the road, giving her what privacy was possible in the confined space of the wagon seat. When they crested the small rise that revealed her modest homestead in the distance, little more than a cabin with a small barn and corral, originally built by Thomas with such hopeful plans for their future, Jacob Quinn finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Valmont, I hope you'll pardon my directness, but I couldn't help noticing." He began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "That is, if you're in need of work, the double circle's looking for someone to help with cooking and such for the hands. The owner's wife, Mrs. Bennett, mentioned just yesterday she could use another pair of hands around the place." Lillian stiffened, wondering if this was a charitable offer born of pity. "I appreciate the thought, Mr. Quinn, but it's honest work for fair pay," he continued. "And there's a small cabin near the main house where you and your little one could stay. Mrs. Bennett's a kind woman, raised 5 children of her own. She'd have no objection to the baby." The wagon rattled over the wooden bridge spanning Willow Creek, and Lillian used the momentary noise to gather her thoughts. Pride told her to refuse, to somehow manage on her own as she had been trying to do since Thomas died. Reality reminded her that the food she'd just purchased would last 2 weeks at most, and then what? "I've never worked on a ranch," she said finally. Jacob's mouth curved in a slight smile that transformed his weathered face. "Can you cook better than Cookie Jenkins?" Because that wouldn't take much. Man's biscuits could serve as horseshoes in a pinch. Despite herself, Lillian felt an answering smile tug at her lips. "I'm a good cook. My mother taught me." "Then you're already qualified," he replied simply. They reached the cabin, and Jacob brought the wagon to a halt, setting the brake before jumping down to help her. His hands were strong and calloused but gentle as he assisted her from the seat, careful of the baby still fussing in her arms. "Let me bring these inside for you," he said, gathering her packages. The cabin's interior was neat but sparse, evidence of possessions sold off one by one as necessity demanded. Lillian went immediately to prepare some of the condensed milk for Emma, her movements quick and practiced, despite the infant's weight in one arm. Jacob set the packages on the small table and removed his hat, standing somewhat awkwardly in the center of the single room. His eyes took in the carefully mended curtains at the windows, the swept floor, the few personal items that remained a daguerreotype of a young couple on their wedding day, a patchwork quilt on the narrow bed, a worn Bible on the small shelf. "I'll leave you to tend to your little one," he said, turning toward the door. "But Mrs. Valmont, if you're interested in the position at the Double Circle, I'd be glad to come by tomorrow and bring you and the baby to meet Mrs. Bennett." Lillian looked up from where she was now feeding Emma, the baby eagerly taking the improvised bottle. The relief of seeing her daughter's hunger being satisfied overwhelmed her defenses, and she felt tears threatening. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn," she managed. "I would appreciate that opportunity." He nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll come by mid-morning if that suits." "Yes, thank you." At the doorway, he paused, turning back with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Valmont, I hope you don't mind my saying, but what you did today," his eyes flicked briefly to her shorn hair. "That was brave. A mother's sacrifice for her child is something to be respected, not pitied." Before she could respond, he was gone, the sound of the wagon wheels fading as he drove back toward the road. Lillian sat for a long time after he left, feeding Emma until the baby fell into a contented sleep, her tiny stomach finally full. Only then did Lillian allow herself to approach the small mirror hanging near the washstand. The reflection that greeted her was shocking, her hair unevenly cut, the shortest parts barely covering her ears, the longest reaching her jaw in uneven chunks. The hair buyer had been concerned only with preserving the length he was purchasing, not with how she would look afterward. She touched the ragged ends, tears slipping down her cheeks at the loss of what had been her one remaining beauty. But then her eyes fell on Emma, peacefully sleeping, and she knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. Tomorrow she would meet Mrs. Bennet. Perhaps the double circle would offer a new beginning, a chance to rebuild their lives. And if not, she would find another way. She had to, for Emma's sake. Morning brought a clarity Lillian hadn't felt in months. After feeding Emma with the precious condensed milk and performing her daily chores, she set about preparing herself for the meeting with Mrs. Bennet. She heated water and washed thoroughly, then put on her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been quite fashionable, but now hung loosely on her frame after months of too little food. The hair presented a more difficult challenge. After several attempts to arrange it attractively, she finally secured a scarf over the worst of the uneven edges, tying it at the nape of her neck. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Emma, perhaps sensing the importance of the day, was unusually content, cooing softly as Lillian changed her into the cleanest of her few garments. "We're going to meet some new people today," Lillian told her daughter, forcing brightness into her voice. "People who might help us start fresh." The sound of wagon wheels announced Jacob Quinn's arrival precisely at mid-morning, as promised. Lillian gathered Emma and the small bundle of necessities she'd prepared, taking one final look around the cabin before stepping outside. Jacob had clearly made an effort with his own appearance. His clothes, while still workmanlike, were cleaner than the previous days, his dark hair damp from a recent washing, his face freshly shaved. He jumped down from the wagon as she appeared, and she noticed he'd added a thin cushion to the hard wooden seat. "Morning, Mrs. Valmont," he greeted, his eyes taking in her efforts to tidy her appearance with quiet approval. "You and the little one ready for a ride out to the ranch?" "Yes, thank you for coming," she replied, suddenly nervous about the prospect of seeking employment. It had been years since she'd worked for others, not since before her marriage, when she'd briefly served as a schoolteacher in Denver. He helped her into the wagon with the same gentle courtesy he'd shown the previous day, making sure she and Emma were securely settled before climbing up beside them. As they set off toward the north, he seemed to sense her anxiety. "Mrs. Bennet is looking forward to meeting you," he said conversationally. "The ranch has grown this past year, and she's been saying for months she needs help managing the household. We've got 12 hands now, all needing feeding 3 times a day." 12, Lillian repeated, trying to imagine preparing meals for so many hungry men after months of barely feeding herself. Jacob smiled. "Don't worry, there's already Cookie handling most of it, but his talents run more to quantity than quality, if you take my meaning. Mrs. Bennet supervises the house and helps with the cooking when she can, but with Mr. Bennet expanding the operation and her rheumatism acting up, she's been looking for someone reliable to assist her." As they traveled, Jacob pointed out landmarks and shared information about the double circle. Founded 15 years earlier by Harold Bennet, it had grown from a modest cattle operation into one of the most respected ranches in the region, running nearly 2,000 head of cattle across 30,000 acres. "Mr. Bennett's got a good eye for breeding stock," Jacob explained. "And he treats his men fair. I've been with them 8 years now, worked my way up to foreman 3 years back." "You're not from Colorado originally?" Lillian asked, finding herself genuinely interested in his story. "Texas born and raised," he replied. "Rode north with a cattle drive when I was 22 and never quite made it back. Colorado got under my skin, I suppose." He glanced at her. "What about you, Mrs. Valmont? You're not from these parts either, I'd wager." "St. Louis," she answered. "My husband Thomas heard there was good land to be had out here. We came west 2 years ago with such dreams." She looked down at Emma. "He never even got to meet her. The fever took him 3 months before she was born." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Valmont. It's a hard country sometimes." "Yes," she agreed softly, "but it can be beautiful too." They crested a hill, and suddenly the double-circle ranch spread before them, a sprawling complex of buildings nestled in a verdant valley. The main house was substantial, a two-story structure built of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Nearby stood a bunkhouse, barn, stables, and several smaller cabins. Men moved about the yard, leading horses or carrying supplies, while smoke rose steadily from the cookhouse chimney. "It's larger than I expected," Lillian murmured, suddenly intimidated by the scope of the operation. "Don't let the size fool you," Jacob replied. "It's still a family place at heart. The Bennetts run it like one big household, not like some of these corporate outfits moving in from back east." He guided the wagon toward the main house, where a woman stood waiting on the porch. Mrs. Bennett was a stout, silver-haired matron with a face that spoke of years of sun and wind, but her eyes were kind and alert as she watched their approach. "That's Mrs. Bennett," Jacob confirmed. "She's been anxious to meet you." The wagon came to a stop, and before Jacob could assist her, Mrs. Bennett was making her way down the porch steps with surprising agility for a woman troubled by rheumatism. "You must be Mrs. Valmont," she called warmly. "And this must be your little one. Come in, come in. You've had a dusty ride and you'll be wanting to refresh yourselves." Lillian found herself ushered into the house with such genuine hospitality that her nervousness began to ebb. The interior was comfortable rather than ostentatious, good, solid furniture arranged for practical use. Colorful rag rugs on polished wooden floors, walls adorned with family photographs, and a few modestly framed paintings of Western landscapes. Mrs. Bennett led them to a spacious kitchen at the rear of the house, where delicious aromas suggested something substantial was cooking for the midday meal. "Jacob, do fetch Mr. Bennett," she instructed. "Tell him our guests have arrived," as Jacob departed on his errand. Mrs. Bennett turned her attention fully to Lillian and Emma. "What a beautiful child," she remarked, her weathered face softening as she gazed at the infant. "How old is she?" 3 months, Lillian answered. "Her name is Emma." "A lovely name for a lovely girl," Mrs. Bennett approved. "And you, my dear, must be exhausted caring for her on your own. Jacob mentioned your circumstances. I'm so sorry about your husband." There was no pity in her tone, only genuine compassion that somehow made it easier for Lillian to accept. "Thank you, it's been difficult," she admitted. "I can only imagine," Mrs. Bennett replied. "But you're here now, and if things work out, perhaps life might get a bit easier for both of you." She gestured to a chair at the large kitchen table. "Sit, please. You look like you could use some feeding up yourself." Before Lillian could protest, Mrs. Bennett had placed a mug of coffee and a plate with a thick slice of freshly baked bread and butter before her. The aroma alone made Lillian's stomach clench with hunger. "Now," Mrs. Bennett continued, settling herself across the table, "Jacob tells me you're a good cook." "My mother taught me," Lillian confirmed, repeating what she'd told Jacob. "I can manage most standard dishes, though I haven't had much opportunity to cook with fancy ingredients." Mrs. Bennett waved a dismissive hand. "Fancy doesn't fill stomachs. Our boys need hearty, well-prepared food, not French fripperies. Can you bake bread?" "Yes, madam, and pies, cakes when the occasion calls for it." "Good, good, and you're not afraid of hard work?" "No, madam." Mrs. Bennett's keen eyes studied her for a moment. "I'll be straight with you, Mrs. Valmont. The position involves helping me manage this household, cooking, cleaning, laundry, all the tasks that keep a place like this running. The hours are long, especially during roundup and branding season. But the pay is fair, $30 a month plus room and board for you and your little one. You'd have the cabin just behind the main house. It's small but sound, with its own stove and pump. $30 a month. It was more than Lillian had dared hope for, enough to begin saving for Emma's future, perhaps even to eventually reclaim her homestead, which she currently had no means to work or improve. "That sounds more than fair," Lillian replied, her voice steady despite the relief flooding through her. The kitchen door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick gray mustache entered, followed by Jacob. Harold Bennett had the weathered look of a man who'd spent decades under open skies, but his handshake was firm and his smile genuine as Jacob made the introductions. "My wife tells me you might be joining our operation, Mrs. Valmont," he said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a former tobacco user. "Any questions I can answer for you? Mr. Bennett owns most of the water rights in this valley," Jacob explained. "He's been expanding the herd every year since I've been here." Harold Bennett looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. "We've been fortunate," he said modestly. "Good years, good men." His eyes shifted to Emma, who was beginning to fuss in Lillian's arms. "And it seems we might be adding a new youngest member to our extended family." "If you'll have us, sir," Lillian replied. "I promise to work hard and earn my keep." Mr. Bennett exchanged a look with his wife, some silent communication passing between them. "When can you start?" he asked simply. "I would need to make arrangements for my homestead," Lillian answered, her mind racing through practical considerations. "Perhaps in a few days. Jacob can help you with that," Mrs. Bennett said decisively. "Can't you, Jacob?" The foreman nodded. "Yes, madam." "I could bring some of the boys to secure the place, maybe check on it regular like to make sure everything stays as it should." "Then it's settled," Mr. Bennett declared. "Welcome to the double circle, Mrs. Valmont." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Jacob brought 2 ranch hands to help Lillian prepare her homestead for an extended absence. They repaired a loose section of roof, secured the windows and doors, and moved the few items of value to the small barn, which could be properly locked. Throughout it all, Jacob was a steady, reassuring presence, offering practical suggestions without overstepping or making her feel incompetent. He seemed to understand intuitively when to help and when to step back and let her handle things herself. On the morning of their departure for the ranch, Lillian stood in the doorway of the cabin, Emma securely bundled against her chest, taking a final look at the home she and Thomas had built with such hope. It wasn't goodbye forever, she reminded herself. With steady work and savings, she might return one day, perhaps lease the land to neighboring farmers until Emma was old enough for Lillian to consider a more permanent plan. "Ready?" Jacob asked quietly from behind her. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. He took her small trunk of belongings and loaded it onto the wagon while she secured Emma in the makeshift carrier. Mrs. Bennett had sent a clever sling arrangement that allowed the baby to rest comfortably while leaving Lillian's hands free. The journey to the double circle was made mostly in companionable silence, broken occasionally by Jacob's observations about the changing landscape or gentle inquiries about Emma's comfort. By the time they reached the ranch, Lillian felt a cautious optimism taking root alongside her natural anxiety about the new situation. Mrs. Bennett was waiting to show them to the cabin that would be their new home. Though small, it was clean and well-maintained, with a comfortable bed, a sturdy table and chairs, a cast-iron stove, and even a rocking chair positioned near the window. "It was my sewing room for a while," Mrs. Bennett explained, "but I've moved all that back into the main house. I thought you might appreciate having your own space, especially with the baby." "It's perfect," Lillian said sincerely, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings. "Thank you for your kindness." "Get settled in today," Mrs. Bennett instructed. "Tomorrow's soon enough to start your duties." "Dinner's at 6 in the main house. We eat with the hands in the big dining room. Cookie will be glad for the reinforcements starting tomorrow." She paused at the door. "And Mrs. Valmont, I'm glad you're here." Left alone with Emma, Lillian unpacked their few belongings, arranging the cabin to suit their needs. She placed Thomas's photograph on the small shelf near the bed, saying a silent prayer that he would approve of her decision, that he would understand she was doing what was necessary for their daughter's future. As promised, dinner that evening was a lively affair. The long dining room in the main house accommodated the 12 ranch hands, the Bennetts, Jacob as foreman, and now Lillian and Emma. Cookie, a grizzled old cowboy with a limp and a perpetual scowl that belied his genuine concern for his boys getting proper nutrition, served up enormous platters of beef, potatoes, and beans, along with the infamous biscuits Jacob had mentioned. Lillian found herself seated between Mrs. Bennett and Jacob, with Mr. Bennett at the head of the table. The men were polite if somewhat awkward around her at first, most of them nodding respectfully before turning their attention to the serious business of filling their plates. "Don't mind them," Jacob murmured for her ears alone. "Some of these boys haven't had a proper conversation with a lady in months. They'll warm up once they get used to you." Gradually, as the meal progressed, the initial stiffness eased. Mrs. Bennett skillfully drew Lillian into the general conversation, asking questions that allowed her to share a little of her background without feeling exposed or vulnerable. By the time apple pie was served, Cookie's one undisputed culinary triumph, Lillian felt the first tendrils of belonging taking root. Later, as Jacob walked her back to her cabin through the gathering dusk, Emma sleeping soundly against her shoulder, Lillian found herself relaxing in his company in a way she hadn't with any man since Thomas died. "Thank you," she said simply as they reached her door. "For what?" he asked, genuine confusion in his eyes. "For noticing," she replied. "For bringing me here, for giving Emma and me a chance." His expression softened in the fading light. "You're doing all the hard work, Mrs. Valmont. I just pointed you toward an opportunity." "Lillian," she said suddenly. "My name is Lillian." A smile spread slowly across his face. "Lillian," he repeated, as though testing the feel of it on his tongue. "It suits you." She felt an unexpected warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Good night, Mr. Quinn." "Jacob," he corrected gently. "If I'm calling you Lillian seems only fair." "Good night, Jacob," she amended, a smile tugging at her own lips. "Good night, Lillian," he replied, waiting until she was safely inside before turning back toward the bunkhouse where the other men slept. The following weeks established a rhythm to Lillian's new life at the Double Circle. She rose before dawn to feed Emma, then made her way to the main house kitchen where she assisted Mrs. Bennett and occasionally Cookie in preparing breakfast for the hungry ranch hands. The morning meal was a hearty affair, stacks of pancakes, eggs, bacon or salt pork, and always coffee strong enough, as one wrangler put it, to float a horseshoe. After breakfast, while the men dispersed to their various duties around the ranch, Lillian helped with cleaning the main house, laundry, or food preparation for the midday and evening meals. Mrs. Bennett proved to be a patient teacher and a considerate employer, insisting that Lillian take regular breaks to tend to Emma and never pushing her beyond reasonable expectations. Emma thrived in the new environment. The fresh air, regular meals improving Lillian's own health and consequently her ability to nurse, and the constant attention from the ranch's extended family all contributed to the baby's contentment. She grew plumper, more alert, quick to smile and coo at the many faces that appeared over her cradle. Jacob, Lillian noticed, made a point of stopping by the kitchen or wherever she happened to be working several times throughout each day. His visits were brief, ostensibly to discuss ranch business with Mrs. Bennett or to fetch something needed for his work. But he never failed to inquire after Emma's welfare or to share some small observation or gentle jest that increasingly brought a smile to Lillian's face. As May turned to June and the days grew longer and warmer, Lillian's hair began to grow out as well. No longer the ragged mess left by the hair buyer's shears, it was now a soft cap of chestnut curls that framed her face in a way that, Mrs. Bennett assured her, was quite becoming. "You've got the bone structure for short hair," the older woman remarked one afternoon as they shelled peas on the back porch. "Not everyone does, you know. My eldest daughter tried cutting hers once, looked like a plucked chicken for months, poor thing." Lillian laughed, a sound that was becoming less rare with each passing day. "I still miss being able to braid it," she admitted, but it is easier to manage with all the work." Mrs. Bennet's knowing eyes studied her for a moment. Jacob seems to approve of it. Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sure Mr. Quinn has more important things to notice than my hair." Mrs. Bennet hummed noncommittally. "He's a good man, Jacob. Harold says he's the finest foreman we've ever had, honest, hardworking, kind to animals and people alike." "Yes, he seems to be all those things," Lillian agreed carefully, keeping her eyes on the peas in her lap. "Been on his own a long time, though," Mrs. Bennet continued casually. "Never married, though not for lack of interest from some of the young ladies in town. Too busy building his future, he always says." Lillian wasn't sure how to respond to this information or why Mrs. Bennet was sharing it. Surely the older woman wasn't suggesting. But no, that would be inappropriate. She was a recent widow with a small child, hardly a suitable prospect for the ranch foreman, regardless of his unmarried status. Fortunately, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Bennet, his expression serious as he approached the porch. "Hannah," he addressed his wife, "just got word from town. Rustlers hit the Peterson place last night, took nearly 30 head and shot young Peterson when he tried to stop them." Mrs. Bennet's hand flew to her mouth. "Is the boy?" "He'll live, Doc says, but it was a close thing. Sheriff's putting together a posse. I've sent Jacob and 4 of the boys to join them." Lillian felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Rustlers were known to be desperate, dangerous men, often not hesitating to kill anyone who stood in their way. The thought of Jacob riding out to confront such men filled her with a dread that surprised her with its intensity. "When will they return?" she asked before she could stop herself. Mr. Bennet's weathered face softened slightly as he looked at her. "Hard to say, Mrs. Valmont. Depends on how far they have to track them. Could be a day or 2, might be longer." That night, after settling Emma in the cradle beside her bed, Lillian found herself unable to sleep. She stood at the small window of her cabin, looking out at the star-filled sky, offering silent prayers for the safety of Jacob and the other men. It was only then, in the quiet darkness, that she allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been carefully avoiding for weeks. She had developed feelings for Jacob Quinn that went beyond gratitude or friendship. Feelings that both frightened and exhilarated her, feelings she had no right to indulge so soon after Thomas's death, feelings that Jacob himself might not welcome or return. "It's foolishness," she whispered to herself. "You hardly know the man," but her heart argued otherwise. She knew his kindness, his steady reliability, the gentle way he spoke to Emma, the respect he showed to everyone from Mr. Bennet down to the youngest stable boy. She knew the quiet strength in his hands, the thoughtful intelligence in his blue eyes, the rare but transformative smile that could light his entire face. 3 days passed with no word from the posse. Lillian threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from worry, but found her eyes constantly straying to the northern horizon where the men had disappeared. Mrs. Bennet, noticing her distraction, assigned her less demanding tasks and gently encouraged her to rest when Emma was sleeping. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Lillian was hanging laundry on the line behind the main house when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Shading her eyes against the summer sun, she made out a group of riders approaching from the north, 8 or 9 men, moving at a steady but unhurried pace that suggested neither emergency nor defeat. She stood frozen, laundry basket at her feet, searching the approaching figures for Jacob's familiar silhouette. The riders drew closer, dust rising from their horses' hooves in the dry summer air. She counted 9 men, 10, 11, her heart stuttered. Where was the 12th? Had someone been left behind? Injured? Worse? The group was close enough now that she could begin to distinguish individuals. Mr. Bennet rode at the front alongside Sheriff Davis, their heads bent in conversation. Behind them came ranch hands she recognized: Tom Wilkins, Hank Morse, young Billy Parker, barely 18 and trying so hard to be taken seriously as a cowhand. And there, riding slightly apart at the rear of the group, was Jacob. Relief flooded through her with such force that she had to grip the clothesline for support. He was dusty, unshaven, clearly exhausted, but alive and apparently unharmed. As though sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the remaining distance. Even from afar, she could see his face lighten, the ghost of a smile touching his lips as he raised a hand in greeting. She returned the gesture before gathering her empty basket and hurrying toward the main house to help Mrs. Bennet prepare food and coffee for the returning men. The kitchen was soon bustling with activity as the ranch hands crowded around the large table, gratefully accepting plates of food and mugs of strong coffee. The mood was somber, but satisfied they had recovered most of the stolen cattle and apprehended 3 of the 5 rustlers. The other 2 had escaped across the territorial line but were known to the sheriff and would be pursued. Jacob entered last, having taken time to see to his horse, before seeking his own comfort, a trait Lillian had noticed and admired before. He looked even more exhausted up close, with dark circles under his eyes and several days' worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. "You should eat something," she said, placing a heaping plate before him as he sank into a chair. "Thank you," he replied, his voice rough with fatigue. Their eyes met briefly, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Are you hurt?" she asked quietly, noticing for the first time a tear in his shirt sleeve with what looked like dried blood around the edges. He glanced down as if surprised. "Just a scratch." "Branch caught me as we were riding through a gulch, nothing serious." "Let me see it properly after you've eaten," she insisted, her tone allowing no argument. He nodded, too tired to protest, and turned his attention to the food before him. Lillian moved away to help Mrs. Bennet serve the others, but she found her gaze repeatedly drawn back to Jacob throughout the meal, reassuring herself that he was truly safe and well. When the men had eaten their fill and begun to drift away to their bunks for much-needed rest, Jacob remained at the table, nursing a final cup of coffee. Lillian approached with a small basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a tin of salve Mrs. Bennet had provided. "You don't need to fuss," Jacob protested half-heartedly as she set the items on the table beside him. "It's not fussing to clean a wound properly," she countered. "Take off your shirt," a flicker of something amusement, embarrassment, crossed his face, but he complied, unbuttoning the dusty, torn garment and shrugging it off his shoulders with a suppressed wince. Lillian had prepared herself to be professional, to treat this as she would any medical necessity. But the sight of Jacob's bare torso, lean and muscled from years of physical labor, tanned deeply where the sun regularly touched, paler across his chest and shoulders, caused a rush of heat to flood her face. The scratch was a jagged cut about 4 inches long across his upper arm, not dangerously deep, but certainly more significant than he had suggested. It had stopped bleeding but was angry and red around the edges. "This could easily become infected," she scolded gently, dipping a cloth in the warm water and beginning to clean away the dirt and dried blood. "Didn't have time to tend to it properly out there," he explained, watching her work with an intensity that made her fingers tremble slightly. "Had to keep moving." "Was it dangerous?" she asked, focusing on her task rather than on the warmth of his skin beneath her hands or the way his muscles tensed slightly at her touch. "Rustlers usually are," he replied simply, "but we were careful. Sheriff Davis knows his business." She cleaned the wound thoroughly, then applied a generous amount of salve before bandaging it with strips of clean cloth. Throughout the process, Jacob remained silent, his eyes never leaving her face, his breathing measured and controlled. "There," she said finally, securing the end of the bandage. "Keep it clean and have Mrs. Bennet check it tomorrow. She's much more experienced with these things than I am." "Thank you," Jacob said, his voice lower and rougher than before. He reached for his shirt but made no immediate move to put it back on. "Lillian." The way he said her name, like something precious he was turning over carefully in his hands, made her look up and meet his gaze directly. "I'm glad you're safe," she said softly, the words inadequate to express the depth of her relief. I thought about you, he confessed. Out there, you and Emma. Kept wondering how you were getting on, if she was still smiling at everyone who passes her cradle, if you were still. He paused, seeming to search for words. Still what? She prompted when he didn't continue. Still looking sad when you think no one's watching, he finished quietly. The simple observation, so accurate and yet so unexpected, brought a sudden sting of tears to her eyes. She had thought she'd hidden her moments of grief and doubt better than that. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I've upset you. I shouldn't have. No, she interrupted, blinking back the tears. No, it's just, you noticed. I notice everything about you, Lillian, he said, the words emerging as if despite himself. I have since that day in the store when you turned around with your hair all chopped off and your chin up like you were daring anyone to pity you. She didn't know how to respond, caught between surprise at his admission and a sudden, wild hope that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Jacob seemed to interpret her silence as discomfort. He reached for his shirt again, pulling it on with a grimace as the movement pulled at his injured arm. Forgive me. I'm tired and talking out of turn. You've been a widow less than a year with a baby to care for. The last thing you need is some cowboy making inappropriate observations. They're not inappropriate, Lillian said quickly. I wasn't expecting. Mrs. Valmont, Mrs. Bennet's voice called from the direction of Lillian's cabin. Emma's awake and asking for her mama quite insistently, the moment shattered. Lillian rose quickly, gathering the basin and unused bandages. I should go to her. Jacob nodded, standing as well. Of course, thank you for tending to my arm. You're welcome, she replied, suddenly awkward. You should rest. You look exhausted. Been better days, he admitted with a small smile. Good night, Lillian. Good night, Jacob. She hurried toward her cabin, mind whirling with the implications of their exchange. Had Jacob been suggesting what she thought? And if so, what should she do about it? Her feelings for him were undeniable, but was it too soon after Thomas? What would people think? What would be best for Emma? Emma's cries grew louder as she approached the cabin, temporarily pushing all other concerns aside. Mrs. Bennet had picked the baby up and was attempting to soothe her, but Emma's face was red with frustration, tiny fists waving in protest. There you are, Mrs. Bennet said with relief, transferring the squalling infant to Lillian's arms. She's been fed and changed, just seems to want her mother. Thank you for watching her, Lillian said, immediately beginning the swaying motion that usually calmed Emma. I was just helping Mr. Quinn with a minor injury. Something knowing flickered in Mrs. Bennet's eyes, but she merely nodded. He works too hard, that one. Always putting everyone else first. She patted Lillian's arm. Not unlike someone else I've come to know. After Mrs. Bennet left, Lillian sat in the rocking chair by the window, Emma gradually quieting against her chest. The summer twilight was fading into darkness, stars appearing one by one in the vast Colorado sky. What do you think, little one? She whispered to her drowsy daughter. Is your mama being foolish? Is it too soon to be feeling this way about someone who isn't your father? Emma, of course, offered no answers, only the soft, even breathing of impending sleep. Lillian continued rocking, her thoughts drifting to Thomas. What would he want for them? He had been a practical man, kind and loving but never sentimental. He would want her to be cared for, to be safe, to find happiness again if possible. He would like Jacob, she decided aloud. He would approve. The realization brought a measure of peace. Whatever might or might not develop between her and Jacob Quinn, she needn't feel guilt or disloyalty for the feelings already taking root in her heart. The following morning brought a flurry of activity as the ranch returned to its normal routines after the disruption of the rustler pursuit. Lillian went about her duties with particular attention, aware of Jacob's presence whenever he entered the main house or passed near where she was working, yet uncertain how to address what had passed between them the previous evening. For his part, Jacob seemed equally unsure. He was unfailingly polite, asking after Emma's welfare and thanking Lillian again for tending his arm, but he maintained a careful distance, as if concerned about overstepping. The situation might have continued in this awkward holding pattern indefinitely if not for Mrs. Bennet's intervention. 3 days after the posse's return, she approached Lillian as she was preparing vegetables for the evening meal. "Mr. Bennet and I are planning a small celebration this Saturday," she announced. "Sort of a thank you to the men for their work catching those rustlers and to mark our 30th wedding anniversary as well." "That sounds lovely," Lillian replied. "Shall I prepare something special for dessert? Your apple pie would be perfect," Mrs. Bennet confirmed. "But that's not why I'm mentioning it. We'll be having music. Hank plays the fiddle quite well and young Billy has a passable voice for ballads. There might be dancing." Lillian looked up from the carrots she was slicing. "Dancing, Mrs. Bennet nodded, her expression innocent but her eyes twinkling. "Nothing formal, just a bit of fun. I thought you might like to know in advance in case you wanted to freshen up that blue dress of yours. It brings out the color in your eyes." Lillian felt herself blushing. "Mrs. Bennet, are you?" "That is, I'm not sure if." The older woman patted her hand. "My dear, you've been working hard, caring for Emma, grieving your husband, and generally putting everyone's needs before your own. An evening of music and perhaps a dance or two isn't going to scandalize anyone." She paused. "And certain parties who have been watching you with puppy eyes for weeks might finally work up the courage to do more than fetch extra firewood for your cabin or coincidentally appear whenever you're walking back from the henhouse." "Jacob has been very kind," Lillian said carefully. "Kind, yes," Mrs. Bennet agreed with a knowing smile. "But a man doesn't ride 20 miles out of his way twice a week to check on an empty homestead out of mere kindness." Lillian nearly dropped the knife she was holding. "He's been checking on the homestead faithfully, Mrs. Bennet confirmed. "Didn't he tell you? Every Wednesday and Sunday without fail he rides out to make sure everything's secure, that no squatters have moved in, that the roof is still sound." "No," Lillian said softly. "He never mentioned it." Mrs. Bennet shrugged. "That's Jacob for you. Does what needs doing without expecting recognition or thanks." She moved toward the pantry, then paused. "The blue dress, Mrs. Valmont, trust me." Saturday arrived with a sense of anticipation that hummed through the entire ranch. The men completed their essential chores early, taking extra time to clean up before the evening festivities. Mr. Bennet had a steer slaughtered for the occasion, and the aroma of roasting beef filled the air from mid-morning. Lillian spent the day helping with preparations, baking her promised apple pies, assisting Cookie with side dishes, and setting up tables in the large barn which had been cleared and swept for the celebration. Throughout it all, she was acutely aware of a nervous excitement building within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since her courting days with Thomas. In the late afternoon, she returned to her cabin to prepare herself and Emma for the evening. The baby was unusually cooperative, allowing herself to be bathed and dressed in her cleanest gown without protest, as if sensing the specialness of the occasion. Lillian took particular care with her own appearance, washing thoroughly and donning the blue dress Mrs. Bennet had suggested. It was her best garment, made of fine cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Thomas had given it to her for her birthday the year before his death. It had grown somewhat loose on her frame after the months of hardship, but a ribbon belt helped define her waist, and the color did indeed complement her eyes and the healthy glow that had returned to her complexion. Her hair presented the usual challenge. In the month since selling it, it had grown out enough to curl softly around her face and just reach the nape of her neck. She brushed it carefully, wishing for pins or combs to arrange it more elegantly, but settling for the simple feminine touches of clean skin, a dab of rose water Mrs. Bennet had given her, and the blue dress Thomas had once admired. As dusk fell, she made her way to the barn with Emma securely in her arms. Lanterns had been hung from the rafters, casting a warm, golden light over the transformed space. Long tables laden with food lined one wall, while the center area had been left clear for dancing. Many of the ranch hands were already present, along with the Bennetts and several neighboring ranchers and their families who had been invited to join the celebration. Lillian found herself welcomed warmly, with several of the wives and daughters cooing over Emma and offering to hold her so Lillian could enjoy the festivities. Mrs. Peterson, whose son had been injured in the rustler attack, was particularly effusive in her thanks for the double circle's assistance in capturing the culprits and recovering their stolen cattle. The evening progressed pleasantly. The food was abundant and hearty, the company jovial, and the music, when Hank struck up his fiddle accompanied by Billy on a mouth organ, surprisingly skillful. Several couples took to the makeshift dance floor, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett leading the way with a sprightliness that belied their years and her rheumatism. Lillian sat at one of the tables, Emma now sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden box lined with soft blankets. She was content to watch the dancing, tapping her foot in time to the music and enjoying the rare opportunity to simply be part of a celebration rather than working behind the scenes. She had been so focused on the dancers that she didn't notice Jacob's approach until he was standing beside her table, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His usually wind-tousled dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean white shirt with his best denim trousers and a leather vest she hadn't seen before. "Evening, Lillian," he greeted, his eyes taking in her appearance with undisguised appreciation. "You look." He seemed to search for an adequate word. "Beautiful," he finished simply. "Thank you," she replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "You look very nice yourself." He glanced at the sleeping Emma, then back to Lillian. "Would you? That is, I was wondering if you might like to dance." Mrs. Peterson said she'd keep an eye on Emma. The older woman sitting nearby nodded encouragingly. "Go on, dear, I've raised 5 of my own." "I know how to watch a sleeping baby." Lillian hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that, thank you." Jacob offered his hand, and she placed her fingers in his, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor just as Hank transitioned into a slower tune, a waltz that required partners to stand closer than the previous lively reels. "I should warn you," Jacob said as he placed his right hand respectfully at her waist, "I'm not much of a dancer. Ranch work doesn't provide many opportunities for practice." "That makes 2 of us," Lillian admitted. "It's been years since I've danced at all." Despite their disclaimers, they moved together with surprising ease, finding a natural rhythm that allowed them to navigate the crowded floor without mishap. Jacob was more graceful than he'd suggested, his inherent physical coordination compensating for any lack of formal dance training. "Your arm seems better," Lillian observed, noting that he showed no signs of pain or stiffness as they moved. "Nearly healed," he confirmed. "Mrs. Bennett changed the bandage yesterday and said it's coming along fine." He paused. "Though I might have healed faster if my first nurse had continued her attentions." The teasing note in his voice emboldened her. "I would have been happy to check on it if asked. I wasn't sure if—" He hesitated. "That evening I said some things that might have seemed forward. I was concerned I'd made you uncomfortable." "You didn't," she assured him. "I was surprised, not uncomfortable." He guided her through a turn, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "Surprised that a rough cowboy like me would notice such things." "Surprised that anyone would notice," she corrected gently. "I've been so focused on Emma, on surviving, on building this new life that I haven't thought much about how I appear to others." "You appear," Jacob began, then paused as if choosing his words carefully. "Strong, determined. Kind, despite everything you've been through. Beautiful, even with," he caught himself. "Even with my hair chopped off," she finished for him, a small smile playing at her lips. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was going to say even with the weight of your struggles, but yes, that too. Though for what it's worth, I think your hair suits you like this, shows off your eyes." The simple compliment, delivered with such obvious sincerity, warmed her more than any elaborate flattery could have. "Mrs. Bennett mentioned you've been checking on my homestead." she said, changing the subject before her emotions could overwhelm her. Now it was Jacob's turn to look surprised. She told you about that, she did. Why didn't you? He shrugged, the movement rippling through their connected hands. Didn't seem important enough to mention. It's on my way to the north pasture anyhow. Mrs. Bennet says it's 20 miles out of your way, Lillian countered. Mrs. Bennet talks too much, he grumbled, but there was no real annoyance in his tone. They danced in silence for a few moments, the music wrapping around them, creating a small pocket of privacy despite the crowded room. Thank you, Lillian said finally, for looking after the place. It means a great deal to me. I know how much it represents, Jacob replied. Not just a piece of land, but the life you and your husband planned, the future you envisioned for Emma. She nodded, touched by his understanding. Yes, exactly that. The music was drawing to a close and Jacob slowed their steps but made no move to release her hand. Lillian, I know it's been less than a year since you lost your husband and you have Emma to consider above all else. I wouldn't presume to. That is, I don't expect. Jacob, she interrupted gently, just say what you're thinking. He took a deep breath. I care for you. More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances. I've tried to keep my distance, to be respectful of your grief, but I find myself looking for reasons to be wherever you are, thinking about you when we're apart, wondering if there might someday be a chance for something more between us. The music had stopped completely now, other couples moving off the floor toward the refreshment table, but they remained standing together, his hand still at her waist, hers resting lightly on his shoulder. I care for you too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, but I'm afraid. Of what? He asked, his blue eyes searching hers. Of feeling this way again, of allowing myself to be vulnerable, of risking Emma's heart as well as my own, she answered honestly. Of what people might think if I allow myself to care for someone so soon after Thomas. I would never rush you, Jacob said firmly. I'm willing to wait as long as necessary to give you and Emma all the time and space you need. As for what others might think. He glanced around the barn and Lillian followed his gaze to where Mrs. Bennet was watching them with undisguised approval, to Mr. Bennet raising a glass in their direction, to the other ranch hands and neighbors who seemed utterly unsurprised to see them standing together in the middle of the dance floor, deep in conversation. I think perhaps we're the last to recognize what everyone else has seen for some time, she said with a small laugh. So it seems, he agreed, a slow smile spreading across his face. Lillian, I'm not asking for promises or commitments, just permission to court you properly when you're ready. To spend time with you and Emma, to see if what I feel, what I hope we both feel might grow into something lasting. She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd planned, of the dreams that had died with him. Then she thought of the past months at the double circle, of the gradual healing that had begun, of Emma thriving in this new community, of the way her heart lightened whenever Jacob appeared. I think, she said carefully, that I would like that very much. His smile widened, transforming his entire face, and Lillian felt an answering joy rise within her. Before either could speak again, Hank struck up another tune, this one faster and more boisterous, and other couples began moving back onto the floor. Another dance. Jacob asked, his eyes never leaving hers. Yes, she replied simply. Another dance. As summer melted into fall, Lillian and Jacob's relationship developed with the same steady, unhurried pace as the changing seasons. True to his word, Jacob made no demands, instead creating small opportunities for them to spend time together, inviting her and Emma on Sunday afternoon rides in his wagon, finding reasons to help with tasks around her cabin, bringing her wildflowers he'd spotted on his rounds of the ranch. Emma, now 7 months old and increasingly mobile, took to Jacob with surprising ease. She would reach for him whenever he entered a room, her tiny face lighting with recognition and delight. For his part, Jacob showed a natural aptitude with the baby, never hesitating to hold her or entertain her while Lillian completed her work, seemingly unfazed by dirty diapers or teething tantrums. As October painted the surrounding hills in golds and reds, Jacob approached Lillian one crisp Saturday evening. "I was wondering if you and Emma might like to join me for a picnic tomorrow after church," he suggested. "There's a pretty spot by the creek I'd like to show you before the weather turns too cold." Lillian agreed readily. Though they'd spent considerable time together over the past months, it had always been in the context of ranch activities or with others nearby. The prospect of a few hours alone, as alone as one could be with a baby, sent a pleasant flutter through her stomach. The following day dawned clear and cool, perfect for their outing. After the simple church service in town, which most of the ranch attended together, Jacob helped Lillian and Emma into his personal wagon, a smaller, better-sprung vehicle than the ranch buckboards, and drove them toward a secluded bend in the creek that ran through Double Circle property. The spot was indeed beautiful, a grassy clearing shaded by cottonwoods now resplendent in autumn color, the creek gurgling peacefully over smooth stones. Jacob had clearly prepared in advance, as a blanket was already spread on the ground, weighted at the corners with small stones, and a picnic hamper waited nearby. "Mrs. Bennett helped with the food," he admitted as he assisted Lillian from the wagon. "My cooking skills are limited to coffee and beans over a campfire. It's perfect," she assured him, taking in the peaceful scene. They settled on the blanket, Emma happily exploring the new textures of grass and blanket. The picnic misses. Bennett had prepared was simple but delicious cold chicken, fresh bread, early apples from the ranch's small orchard, and a jar of honey from hives Mr. Bennett maintained as a hobby. As they ate, conversation flowed easily between them. Jacob shared stories of his youth in Texas, of his first cattle drive north, of the years he'd spent working his way up from ranch hand to foreman. Lillian spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her brief career as a teacher, her courtship with Thomas, and their decision to seek a new life in Colorado. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked. "Coming west?" Lillian considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Despite everything, Thomas's death, the hardships, having to sell my hair to feed Emma, I can't bring myself to regret it. This land gets into your blood somehow. And if we hadn't come, I would never have met you." The last words slipped out before she could reconsider them, but the look of quiet joy that spread across Jacob's face banished any regret she might have felt for the admission. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, "about your homestead." "Oh," she prompted, curious about this unexpected turn in the conversation. "Winter will be here soon," he continued. "It might be harder for me to check on it regularly once the snow comes. I was wondering if you'd consider letting me make some improvements, banking the foundation against the cold, maybe putting on a better roof before next spring. Nothing fancy, just practical work to keep it sound until you decide what you want to do with it long term." Lillian was touched by his thoughtfulness. "That's very kind of you, Jacob, not kindness," he corrected gently. "I know what that place represents to you. I want to help preserve it, whether you eventually decide to sell it, lease it out, or—" He hesitated. "Or what?" she asked. "Or return to it someday," he finished, his eyes carefully neutral. She understood then that he was offering her freedom, acknowledging that her future wasn't necessarily tied to the Double Circle or to him, giving her space to make her own choices without pressure. "I don't know what I'll decide eventually," she admitted. "But yes, I would appreciate your help in maintaining it for now." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. "I thought perhaps next Sunday, if the weather holds, I might ride out there with some of the boys and get started." "I'd like to come too," Lillian decided. "I haven't been back since we left. I should see it, make sure there's nothing of value I've forgotten." "Of course," Jacob agreed. "We can make a day of it." As they were finishing their meal, Emma, who had been contentedly playing with a wooden toy Jacob had carved for her, began to fuss. Lillian recognized the signs of tiredness and gathered her daughter into her arms, rocking her gently. "Someone's ready for her nap," Jacob observed with a smile. "She's had a busy morning," Lillian agreed, continuing the gentle swaying motion that usually soothed Emma to sleep. Jacob watched them for a moment, his expression soft. "You're a wonderful mother, Lillian." "I'm doing my best," she replied, emotion tightening her throat. "Sometimes I worry it's not enough, that she'll grow up feeling the absence of her father too keenly." "Children need love more than anything else," Jacob said thoughtfully, "and she has that in abundance from you. As for a father's influence," he paused. "Many children grow up with good men in their lives who aren't their blood fathers. Uncles, grandfathers, family friends, even employers like Mr. Bennett. Emma won't lack for positive male examples, regardless of what the future holds." There was something in his tone that suggested he was speaking of more than abstract possibilities. But before Lillian could question him further, Emma's eyes drifted closed, her small body relaxing into sleep against her mother's chest. "We should head back," Jacob said, noting the baby's slumber. "Let her sleep properly in her own bed." They packed up the remains of their picnic, Jacob carefully folding the blanket while Lillian settled Emma in a soft nest of shawls in the wagon. The drive back to the ranch was peaceful, filled with comfortable silence and occasional quiet observations about the scenery or ranch affairs. As they approached Lillian's cabin, Jacob slowed the horses. "I've enjoyed today," he said simply. "So have I," she replied, meaning it completely. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering slightly at her waist before he reached for the still sleeping Emma, transferring her with such gentle care that the baby didn't stir. At the cabin door, he handed Emma back, his fingers brushing Lillian's as they completed the exchange. "Sunday then," he confirmed. "To check on your homestead." "Sunday," she agreed, looking up at him with a smile that held promise for more than just a practical errand. The visit to the homestead the following Sunday was bittersweet for Lillian. The small cabin seemed diminished somehow. The dreams she and Thomas had built there faded like the late autumn sunlight filtering through the trees. Jacob and 3 of the ranch hands set to work immediately, assessing what needed to be done to secure the place against winter and beginning the most critical repairs. Lillian, with Emma strapped securely to her chest, walked the boundaries of the property, reacquainting herself with the land Thomas had been so proud to claim as their own. She visited the small garden plot where she'd struggled to coax vegetables from the unyielding soil, the creek where she'd washed their clothes, the graves of the 2 milk cows that had died during the drought that had decimated their hopes of self-sufficiency. By mid-afternoon, the men had made significant progress. The roof had been patched, the foundation banked with earth against the coming cold, and the chimney cleared of bird nests and debris. Jacob found Lillian sitting on the porch step, Emma now awake and babbling happily in her arms. "We've done what we can for today," he said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "We'll come back next week to finish the rest if that's all right with you." "More than all right," she assured him. "I can't thank you enough, Jacob." He settled beside her on the step, his shoulder just touching hers. "How does it feel being back here?" She considered the question carefully. "Strange, like visiting a place from a dream, so much has changed in such a short time." "Do you miss it?" he asked, the question gentle but direct. "Parts of it," she admitted. "The hope we brought here, the plans we made, but not the loneliness after Thomas died, not the fear of not being able to provide for Emma." She looked around at the isolated clearing, the surrounding trees beginning to shed their leaves. "It's peaceful here, but I've come to appreciate having people around us, being part of something larger than just our little family." Jacob nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Communities matter out here. It's too hard to go it alone, especially with a child." "Yes, exactly," she agreed. "The double circle has become home in a way this place never quite managed to be." He seemed to consider her words carefully before speaking again. "Lillian, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you, something important." She turned to look at him, struck by the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" Before he could continue, one of the ranch hands called from the other side of the cabin, asking for Jacob's help with securing a loose section of siding. He rose reluctantly. "It can wait until we're back at the ranch," he assured her. "Tonight, perhaps after Emma's asleep," she nodded, curiosity piqued but willing to be patient. "Tonight, then." The remainder of the afternoon passed quickly as the men completed what work they could and prepared to depart before sunset. The return journey to the double circle was made in the fading light, the wagon full of tired but satisfied workers. Lillian and Emma nestled securely beside Jacob on the driver's seat. After dinner, once Emma had been fed and settled for the night, Lillian waited in her cabin for Jacob's visit. She had changed into her cleanest dress and brushed her hair, which had grown enough now to be gathered with a ribbon at the nape of her neck, small curls escaping to frame her face. A soft knock at the door announced his arrival. When she opened it, she found Jacob standing somewhat nervously on her doorstep, a small package in his hands, his own appearance freshened after the day's labor. "Come in," she invited, stepping aside. He entered, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "I hope it's not too late," he began. "I wanted to give you time to get Emma settled." "It's perfect timing," she assured him, gesturing toward the rocking chair where the baby slept soundly in her cradle. "She's been asleep for about an hour." They sat at the small table, a lamp burning low between them, casting warm light over their faces. Jacob placed the package on the table but made no move to explain it immediately. "You wanted to discuss something?" Lillian prompted gently. He nodded, visibly gathering his thoughts. "Lillian, these past months have been. I've never known anything like them. Getting to know you and Emma, watching you rebuild your life with such courage, finding myself thinking about you first thing each morning and last thing each night." Her heart quickened at his words, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "I know it hasn't been a year yet since Thomas passed," he went on. "I know that might seem too soon to some people. But I can't help how I feel, and I hope that you might feel something similar." "I do," she confirmed softly. "Jacob, being with you has brought joy back into my life when I thought it might be gone forever." Relief and happiness flooded his expression. "Then I need to ask you something important." He pushed the small package toward her. "But first, I'd like you to open this." Curious, Lillian untied the simple string and unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a small wooden box beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. Opening the hinged lid, she found a folded document inside. "What is this?" she asked, unfolding the paper. "The deed to your homestead," Jacob explained, "or it will be once you sign it. I spoke to Mr. Bennett about advancing me part of next year's wages, and he agreed. I've purchased the adjacent property 50 acres that join your land to the west. Better soil, more reliable water access. Together, the two parcels make a viable ranch, small but with real potential." Lillian stared at him, astonished. "Jacob, I don't understand." "Why would you? Because I love you, Lillian," he said simply. "I love you, and I love Emma as if she were my own. I want to build a life with you both, a good life with a real future." Tears filled her eyes at his declaration. "Oh, Jacob," he reached across the table to take her hands in his. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Lillian. Not right away if you're not ready, but when the time feels right to you. We could start by working the combined property together, see if it's what you want, what would be best for Emma. Mr. Bennett has offered to let us continue living here at the double circle until we're ready to move to the homestead permanently. And I'd keep my position as foreman for as long as necessary to build up our own place." "You've thought of everything," she whispered, overwhelmed by the care and planning evident in his proposal. "I've tried to," he acknowledged. "I want you to know I'm serious about providing for you and Emma, about creating security for your future, our future, if you'll have me." Lillian looked at the deed, at the wooden box carved by his own hands, at the man sitting across from her, the man who had noticed her need when she'd been forced to sell her hair to feed her baby. The man who'd promised without words that she would never have to make such sacrifices again. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with certainty. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy, and he rose from his chair, drawing her up with him and into his arms. "Lillian," he murmured, one hand gently cupping her face, "you've made me the happiest man in Colorado." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a first kiss that was tender, reverent, and filled with promise. Lillian's arms wrapped around his waist, her body fitting perfectly against his as she returned the kiss with all the love that had been growing in her heart these past months. When they finally parted, Jacob rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly uneven. "I promise you'll never have to face hardship alone again," he said fervently. "You'll never have to make the kind of sacrifice you made that day in town, not while I have breath in my body." "I believe you," she replied, and she did with her whole heart. A small sound from the cradle drew their attention, and they moved together to check on Emma. The baby had stirred but wasn't fully awake, her tiny fists opening and closing as she dreamed. "She'll be your daughter too," Lillian said softly. "In every way that matters." Jacob's finger gently traced the curve of Emma's cheek. "I'll love her as my own," he promised. "And maybe someday, if you're willing, she might have brothers or sisters to grow up with." The image of their expanded family children with Jacob's blue eyes or her chestnut hair, running and laughing on their own land, filled Lillian with a happiness so complete it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I would like that very much," she told him. Later, after Jacob had reluctantly taken his leave with one final kiss goodnight, Lillian stood at her cabin window gazing up at the star-filled sky. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the hopeful departure from St. Louis with Thomas, the joys and struggles of establishing their homestead, the devastating loss of her husband, the desperate decision to sell her hair, and the unexpected second chance at happiness that had begun that day in Mrs. Hannigan's store. "Thank you," she whispered to the heavens, uncertain if she was addressing God, Thomas's memory, or simply expressing gratitude to the universe for the twists of fate that had led her to this moment of renewed hope and love. Across the ranch yard, a light still burned in the foreman's quarters, and Lillian knew that Jacob too was awake, planning their future, perhaps writing to his family in Texas with news of his engagement, or simply savoring the joy of the evening as she was. Tomorrow would bring practical considerations: when to marry, how to combine their lives, what would be best for Emma. But tonight was for dreams, for the certainty that the sacrifice of her hair had led not to an ending but to a beginning, a new chapter richer and more promising than she could have imagined in her darkest hours. Lillian and Jacob were married the following spring, when the wildflowers carpeted the hills around Montrose, and Emma, now a year old, was taking her first tentative steps. The ceremony took place at the double circle, with Mr. Bennett proudly giving the bride away and Mrs. Bennett dabbing at tears throughout the simple service. Their union was celebrated by the entire ranch community, and many of the neighboring families who had come to know and respect both the quiet, capable foreman and the determined young widow who had rebuilt her life with such grace. Emma, dressed in a white gown Lillian had painstakingly sewn from fabric provided by Mrs. Bennett, was an integral part of the ceremony, held in Jacob's strong arms as he and Lillian exchanged their vows. "I take you, Lillian, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Jacob pledged, his voice carrying clearly across the flower-decorated ranch yard. "To love and to cherish, to protect and provide for all the days of my life. And I promise to be a true father to Emma, to love her as my own flesh and blood, to guide and guard her always." Lillian's answering vows, spoken through happy tears, included her promise to create a home filled with love and laughter, to stand by Jacob through whatever challenges they might face, and to honor the new family they were forming together. When the local minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of all the love that had grown between them over the past year. Emma, caught between them, giggled and patted both their faces, bringing smiles and applause from the assembled guests. The celebration continued well into the evening, with plenty of food, music, dancing, and good wishes for the new family. Mr. Bennet surprised them with a wedding gift, a team of strong young horses and a newly built wagon to help them establish their homestead when they were ready. "No rush," he assured them. "You're both still needed here at the Double Circle for as long as you want to stay." They had decided to remain at the ranch through the summer and fall, with Jacob continuing his duties as foreman while they worked together on weekends to prepare their combined property for eventual full-time residence. The original cabin was being expanded and improved, with a proper bedroom added for Emma, and the groundwork laid for additional rooms as their family grew. Their wedding night was spent in the foreman's quarters, which had been vacated by the other men and decorated with wildflowers by Mrs. Bennet. Emma slept peacefully in a cradle beside their bed, undisturbed by the newlyweds' whispered words of love and tender discoveries of each other. In the quiet aftermath of their lovemaking, Lillian lay in the circle of Jacob's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" he asked, his fingers gently stroking the chestnut hair that now reached past her shoulders, growing back thicker and more lustrous than before. "Completely," she assured him, pressing a kiss to his skin. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he replied. "I have everything a man could want: a beautiful wife, a daughter to love, land of our own, good work, and a future full of promise." She raised herself on one elbow to look into his face, struck anew by the love she saw there. "When I sold my hair that day, I thought I was at the lowest point of my life," she confessed. "I never imagined it would lead me to the greatest happiness I've known." Jacob reached up to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "You'll never have to make a sacrifice like that again," he promised once more. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Together," she agreed, settling back into his embrace. "The three of us. And maybe more someday soon," he added with a smile she could hear in his voice. Lillian's hand drifted to her stomach, a secret joy filling her heart. "Sooner than you might think," she whispered. "If the signs I've been noticing these past weeks mean what I think they do." Jacob went very still beneath her. "Lillian, are you saying?" She nodded against his chest. "I can't be certain yet, but I believe we might be welcoming another little Quinn around Christmas time." His arms tightened around her, and she could feel the rapid acceleration of his heartbeat. "A baby," he breathed, wonder filling his voice. "Our baby." "Emma will be a wonderful big sister," Lillian said, happiness bubbling through her like a spring. "And you, Jacob Quinn, will be the finest father 2 children could ask for." "I'll do my best to live up to that," he promised solemnly, "every single day." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, dreams of their future filling their hearts, a future built on love, mutual respect, and the unshakable foundation of a family created not just by blood, but by choice and commitment. 5 years later, Lillian stood on the porch of their expanded homestead, watching as Jacob taught their son James to ride his first pony. Emma, now 6 and as capable as her mother had been at twice her age, was helping by holding the lead rope and offering enthusiastic instructions to her little brother. "Keep your heels down, Jamie," she called importantly, "and hold the reins like Pa showed you." Jacob's patient guidance and James's determined concentration were a sight that filled Lillian's heart with contentment. Their third child, 2-year-old Sarah, played at her feet, arranging pebbles in careful patterns, and occasionally looking up to check that her mother was still watching her important work. The homestead had flourished under their combined efforts. The cabin was now a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The land Jacob had purchased had indeed proved to have better soil, and their vegetable garden and small orchard produced abundantly. They ran a modest herd of cattle and kept chickens, pigs, and a milk cow, providing most of what their growing family needed. Jacob still worked part-time at the Double Circle, his experience and judgment valued too highly by Mr. Bennet to lose entirely, but their own property now provided the majority of their income. Lillian had started a small side business selling preserves and baked goods in Montrose, her recipes earning a reputation that brought customers from as far as 20 miles away. They were not wealthy by any conventional standard, but they were secure, self-sufficient, and rich in the ways that mattered most healthy children: meaningful work, deep love, and strong connections to their community. Lillian's hand went absently to her hair, now fully regrown and hanging in a thick braid down her back. The desperate young widow who had sold her hair to feed her baby seemed like a character from a story sometimes, so far removed from the confident, contented woman she had become. The sound of hoofbeats announced a visitor, and Lillian looked up to see Mrs. Bennet approaching in her buggy. Now in her 60s but still spry despite her rheumatism, the older woman remained a cherished friend and honorary grandmother to their children. "Just thought I'd stop by on my way back from town," Mrs. Bennet called as she drew her horse to a halt. "Got some news you and Jacob might be interested in." Jacob, hearing her voice, led James's pony toward the house, Emma still importantly holding the lead rope. "Mrs. Bennet," he greeted warmly. "What brings you out this way?" "News from back east," she replied, accepting Lillian's help down from the buggy. "Harold got a letter yesterday from his cousin in New York. Seems those fashionable ladies there have a new style short hair, can you imagine? They're cutting it all off deliberately, saying it's more practical, more modern." Lillian and Jacob exchanged a look, both remembering the desperate sacrifice of years ago. "Is that so?" Lillian said, amusement coloring her voice. "Indeed, Mrs. Bennet confirmed, bending to admire Sarah's arrangement of pebbles. "They're paying good money to have it cut just like yours was, Lillian, when you first came to us. What do you think of that?" Lillian laughed, the sound carrying across the homestead they had built together. "I think," she said, her eyes meeting Jacob's with shared understanding, "that everything happens for a reason, even the things that seem like tragedies at the time." Jacob moved to stand beside her, his arm slipping naturally around her waist as James abandoned his pony to race to Mrs. Bennet for the sweets she always carried in her pocket. "I've thought that many times myself," he agreed, pressing a kiss to Lillian's temple. "Especially about a certain day in Mrs. Hannigan's store. The day you promised I'd never have to sacrifice like that again," Lillian recalled softly. "A promise I intend to keep for the rest of our lives," he assured her. As they welcomed Mrs. Bennet into their home, their children chattering excitedly around them, Lillian felt the familiar surge of gratitude for the unexpected path her life had taken. From the depths of despair to the heights of happiness, from selling her hair to feed her baby to creating a home where no one would ever go hungry again, it was a journey she would never have chosen but could never regret. For it had led her here, to Jacob, to their expanded family, to a life rich with purpose and love. A life where sacrifice was shared and burdens halved, where joy was multiplied with each passing season, where the promise made by a kind-hearted cowboy to a desperate young widow had been fulfilled beyond either's wildest dreams.